Hector if he could speak for half an hour or so, just on the whole perspective of land use and the perspective of the church. Something like that. Is that right?
That may have been what it was originally. I think I should say I was kind of voted in almost at the last moment to do this bit when whoever was going to do it originally was a minister, I think, had to withdraw. And though I was a minister a long time ago, it's been a long time since I've been involved in so closely in the parish ministry and in church affairs like that. I want to take us back to this. Is probably not in keeping with the last session and how practical it has been. I want to take us back to this paradigm that I suggested that Genesis 1 sets out for us, highlighting God, land, and humanity, or God, land, and human community. It's actually a paradigm, I think, for those of you who are interested in biblical theology, that is actually there right through the Bible. We see it in Genesis 2 and 3, or kind of short measure there, because it's a part of the land, the garden, but the principle nevertheless is the same. We see it again in Genesis 8 and 9 in the covenant that God makes with humanity, the new humanity in Noah, and at the same time the covenant that He makes with the newly washed land, which God gives to the new humanity as Noah comes from the boat, the ark. We actually begin to see it as well in Genesis 12 and from Genesis 12 onwards, again with this whole concept of the covenant, the eternal covenant relationship that God enters into with Abraham, the humanity in Abraham and his seed or his descendants. And of course, to Abraham is given the land, or at least is promised a land. So these elements of God, land, and humanity are just the framework for our understanding of so much. The promise made to Abraham begins to come to completion in the experience of his descendants Israel and their entrance into the land promise. Again, all of that is kind of a subsection of Genesis chapter 1 because it's one family and one part of the land, which is the earth. But then as we come into the New Testament, through the new covenant in Jesus Christ, God's new humanity is promised land, that is, in fact, the whole earth. And of course, biblically speaking, the earth. When we talk about the earth, we talk about it in terms of Genesis 1, and that means that the whole of the universe is actually part of the environment of the earth. So Genesis 1 shows us that the earth is actually theologically the center of the universe. There was a time when folks thought that the earth was quite physically the center of the universe. We know that that's not the case now. But what Genesis 1 is about is that the earth is actually theologically the center of the universe. So through the new covenant in Jesus Christ, the new humanity is promised land, that is the earth. Remember Jesus' words in the Beatitudes, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit, not the land, not Israel, they shall inherit the earth. So he's back to the Genesis 1 concept of the whole of creation for humanity. And ultimately, of course, in the final two chapters of the book of Revelation, we have the consummation of God, all that God intended from the very beginning. So the new humanity, we see in Revelation 21 and 22, the new humanity dwells in perfect harmony with the new land, the new earth, the new creation, over which that new humanity, the whole of that new humanity rules, just as was intended way back in Genesis chapter 1. So all of humanity has royal dignity and honour and all of that. And God actually comes down and dwells amongst that new humanity forever in the new creation. And all is shalom, all is peace, all is harmony and wholeness. So this paradigm is a very basic paradigm, but the creation paradigm represented in this triangle, as far as I can see, theologically speaking, this is the way God has constituted reality. And so as Christians, we need to take that seriously. We need to take very seriously the God-human side of the triangle. And that's probably what the church has focused on in most of its history, certainly in Highland Church history, especially on our vertical relationship with God. But this side of the triangle also has the human community down here. And we need to take much more seriously than we do our relationships with one another. So I was really interested in what Andrew Morrison was saying there about when splits happen in communities. Well, the church probably knows that more about that than anybody else. We are poor. We have been poor examples. So, how can we dare speak to communities that, in one sense, are split? I was also fascinated by just that sense of injustice when Crofter comes to you or whatever and says, well, I received this land from my family. We have that in the church all the time. We received this church building from our forefathers, so you can't do anything with it, So, fellow feeling with you there, all of those things. We have to take much more seriously our relationships with one another. For Christians in the new humanity, which is the church, but also in our relationships with the wider human community into which God has placed us. And what we learn from the scriptures is that the basic rules that guide us in that is that we are to serve. Adam was put in the garden to serve the garden. We are to serve, to love, and to serve, and to care for them. And that's why it's so important for Christians to be involved in politics, in councils, in school boards, in hospital, as hospital visitors, in every aspect of community life. And often, I think, in the church, we have been so narrow, and it's been almost just this dimension, only our relationship with God, that has been important. That's certainly not the reality as constructed in the Bible. But the baseline is also, that relationship is important, but this baseline is also important. The connection between humanity and the land, and it's been indicated, I think, a number of times today, that and certainly highlights the biblical understanding of reality, is that human community is inseparable from the land. It's actually eternally inseparable from the land. And that's a difficult concept for many Christians, because they think of, let's get out of here and go to heaven. That's not the biblical picture. That is, okay, an element of the picture, but a small element of the picture. If we had a clearer creation theology, we would understand that we are inseparable from the land forever. Just, of course, as Jesus Christ is. Rabbi Duncan used to say, the dust of the earth is at the right hand of the majesty on high. Jesus Christ, the dust of this earth. And in some ways that's what guarantees the eternal nature of the earth. Okay, so that we have to take that connection with the land seriously. So why it's important that Christians are farmers and crofters and landowners and involved in conservation and sustainable development and environmental issues and planning and building and all the things that you guys do. And it's been fascinating listening to the way all of these things are worked out. And it's become clear in a number of the presentations today and a number of folks who've spoken that there's no one Christian answer to these issues. But I think what this kind of day does is what the old Christians used to call iron sharpening iron, bringing different perspectives from the realities in which we find ourselves and the work that we're involved in. But we can, I suppose what we seek to do theologically is to bring out some of the principles that we have to keep in mind and work through all the different situations that you find yourselves in on the basis of these principles. If I can just take one example, going back to the example of the land clearances, and I'm going to take the example of the Sutherland land clearances, but I come from the South Lochs area of Lewis, or my parents come from there. So that's a part of Lewis that is impacted by clearances. I was looking back over my genealogical tree on both my father and mother's side just over the weekend, thanks to the great efforts of Bill Lawson, the genealogist in Harris. Go back, it's got my family tree going back into the 1700s, 5 or 6 generations. And as I go back 4 generations, almost all of them come from the single village of Grather. As I go back the 5th and 6th generation, I find reference made to places like Brolam, Unish, Ishkin, and also names that are still villages today, Limmerway and Odense, but villages that were actually cleared in the 1800s. My dad was born in 1910, and he never had a good word to say about the landowners. You absorb all of these things when you're young. You wonder, what's it all about? And it's only as I begun to read about these things that I realised that his forebears, who were thrown off the land in some of the South Lochs villages, as children, the last of them were dying just a couple of years before he was born. So all their stories, of course, were still real in the oral tradition of the people. And I think my dad just struggled with all of that. He could never have voted Tory because of that. I'm married to a woman whose father comes from Scar in Harris. And my father-in-law never voted anything but Tory. Similar kind of community. What was the difference? Well, the landowner down in the North Harris estate, while he was young, actually seemed to be quite a good landowner. Looked after the people to a certain extent, always gave a half a carcass or whatever at the end of the year, or once a year, those kinds of things. So there you have it. My wife's father has one perception of landowning and all of that, and my father had another perception. So I'm going to, that's kind of by the way, but so when I read about the Sutherland clearances, I have a connection, in one sense, in my heart with some of these things. Jim Hunter's book, Set Adrift Upon the World, he gives some space in that book to views expressed by Don MacLeod of Gloomy Memories fame. MacLeod, Strathnaver stonemason, renowned opponent of the clearances of his native Strath. Hunter writes, though, other than the Staffords, became the Duke and Duchess of Sutherland, other than the Staffords and their factors, the group who attract most opprobrium in MacLeod's writing are us, the clergy. And Hunter goes on to quote him. The oppressors always appealed to the clergy for sanction and justification, and were not disappointed. The foulest deeds were glossed over, and all the evil which could not be attributed to the natives themselves, such as severe seasons, famine, and consequent disease, was by those pious gentlemen ascribed to Providence as a punishment for sin. They had always the ear and confidence of the proprietors, and I put it to their conscience to say how often, if ever, they exerted their influence in favour of the oppressed. I have to say that Jim Hunter is much more nuanced than that in his treatment of these same clergy. He does speak of the extreme example of Reverend Walter Ross, minister of Clyne, who in a demonstration of solidarity sat alongside the infamous Patrick Seller through his 1816 trial. From that extreme example, Hunter goes through what he calls, describes as the kind of more vacillating actions of the Reverend David Mackenzie of Farr, who occasionally at least seems to have had the strength and courage not to do all that the estate factors were requiring of him to do. And then, on the other end of the spectrum, are the cases of the Reverend Alexander Sage of Clodonin and his son Donald. Of Alexander Sage, Hunter says he's the one cleric that Donald MacLeod exempted from his strictures. Alexander's son Donald actually he wasn't a minister at the time, or full minister at the time, but he actually lost his home and work as a missionary assistant in Athnes as a result of the clearances. The two sages, whose private opinion was that the clearances were wicked, nevertheless, says Hunter, were of the theological persuasion that held it to be one's Christian duty to make no gesture of resistance to clearance. And that's the position I've heard often quoted. I think they're probably taking it from Romans 13, the opening verses of Romans 13. The powers that be have been ordained of God. He who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. The problem, of course, is that these verses were taken in isolation and should not have been taken in isolation, but should have been looked at against the background of the whole of Scripture and of a framework that is framed by the creation theology. Which, of course, is what many Highland ministers, elders, and members of a slightly later time in the same century did when they began to speak out against other clearances. And guys like John Kennedy and Gustavus Aird of the Free Church, who 127 years before us actually gathered to talk about these things across the road in the Free Church. But they weren't just from the Free Church, those who took that position. We have others like Reverend Donald McCallum of the Church of Scotland, often referred to as the Prophet of Waternish, active across the Highlands and Islands in promoting the HLLRA, which became the Highland Land League. I wonder what would have happened if the sages had a good grasp of creation theology and this creation paradigm set out in Genesis 1 and right through the Bible. It highlights the royal dignity of every human being and the absolutely inseparable bond between the land and the whole of the royal human community. I wonder if that would have enabled them to stand against the landowners. Even though had they done that, that would have been the end of their jobs. Probably would be thrown out of their pulpits and charges by the landowners, because at that time, of course, we have to remember that the landowners were responsible for choosing the parish minister and for paying much, if not all, of his salary. But lest I be misunderstood in what I'm saying here, I'm not critical of all landowners or of all landowners like the Staffords even. Neither is Jim Hunter. He recognises that many of the Staffords' projects, including brickworks and coal mine, did bring benefit to parts of Sutherland, at least for a time, while some of the other projects, he says, continue to yield value. And he highlights above all the arable farms fringing the A9 from the Dornoch Bridge to Carrickay. I'm left wondering what additional lasting benefits there might have been and what untold misery might have been spared had that whole royal human community of landowners and people been able to speak together and to work together to find an even better way forward. I'm just going to leave it here. That's all theoretical, and I realise that you guys are working it out at grassroots level.
Questions?
Sorry?
Questions?
Well, I can try.
Hector has to go to another meeting in 4 minutes.
Yeah. Sorry.
So any brief questions for Hector?
At the time of the clearances, clearly the clergy failed the people, and there are complex reasons for that. I wonder if the church today, though, even if it did try and stand up and speak, whether for the majority of the people it would now be deemed irrelevant.
Today?
I think then they could have made a big difference if it acted differently. I'm just wondering.
I think you're right. Someone else is talking about the secularization of society, but that doesn't absolve us from our duties.
Oh, absolutely.
And hence this gathering here today, to be actually thinking about these things. I just chose the example of the clearances which highlighted at least one inadequacy of the theology of the time. And I embrace fully the element of the theology of salvation and all of that was to the fore, but I embrace it within a framework that has creation theology first, the foundation.
I wonder if the alternative to hostility might have been bloodshed. I'm thinking, I sometimes ask a question to students, why did the Highland tenant not shoot his landlord like the Irish tenant did? And I wonder if also what we see as passivity wasn't always passivity, because the reason we know so much about the clearances is because they were documented as instances where there was resistance. And I'm thinking of the men, the rise of the men, as blueprints for the spokesman who came up in the era of the Mayfair Commission, giving people the model for verbal resistance as opposed to taking it on. I don't know. And by the way, Jim, I read quite a lot of Jim's book, all of it in fact, when it was in draft, and I think both Eddie, Richie and I said, you haven't been very nice to the minister.
But Abby's a daughter of the man, so she would say that. I thought it was actually fairly fair, compared with some of the other things. I mean, I think he has embraced, for example, some of the things that Alan Hall has written about. It's interesting the difference in the 1880s, when they had the land conference, land reform conference across the road. I don't know much of the history there, but I believe that the input from the men and the ministers actually is part of what held back the violence. You'll have a better idea than that of me. I wonder how much of it. I mean, I'd love to actually research a lot more of that. I wonder how much of it is related to the fact the 1880, that early part, certainly in the islands, the evangelical gospel hadn't come to Lewis by then. So you wouldn't have a great number of people who would have had any theology, let alone a creation theology. I think it's probably different in Sutherland. The evangelical gospel came earlier in Sutherland, but I wonder if there are not some of those dimensions to it as well.
Can I say something on that?
Yeah.
I think there's maybe a number of reasons that perhaps two of the reasons that we were brought up as an explanation, because we asked these questions as children. Number one, a lot of men folk were fighting in Europe for the Sutherlands because they felt it was their God-given duty to go and fight for the landlord, or who they still saw as the armed chief. And secondly, because it was not in the nature of certainly Sutherland men to rise up against who they still considered to be this God-appointed head of the clan. And so the men were very confused, I think.
Can women largely do a lot of
As was always the case.
Yes, they did.
Neil Gunn perfectly encapsulated that in the picture as Mr. Thompson quoted from.
My people came Croix Church up there.
Sorry?
My people were Rosses who came out of Croix Church.
Right.
They sheltered in the near the church, but never got in the church.
Yes, I was fascinated by, I think it was in Jim's book, was the 5 women in some place who stripped the constable who had gone and left him walking through the streets naked, to his chagrin, embarrassment and shame. I thought, good on the ladies.
Excellent. Well, let's express our thanks to Hector.